coming. I really, really appreciate it. I'm on a kind of a microphone that I'm not used to using, and I'm going to speak as loudly as I can. I'm being gestured from the back that I need to speak more loudly, and I'll do my best. First of all, I want to introduce my wife Sharon, who's with me tonight. This is my wife Sharon here, my best friend. I was enjoying answering some of your questions, shaking hands. All of a sudden I looked around and people were disappearing. I thought, maybe I'm bored with the tears already. I was pleased to know that you were just gathered to a more convenient location. I did like that room a little bit better. It probably would have been possible for me to talk to you without a microphone. But nonetheless, I'm very glad to have the company. I'm glad to have you all here. You've got some important things to talk about. As we open up that discussion, I want to just tell you a little story to set the tone. The story that I first heard told by a man named Emo Phillips. He told a story about when he was in Downers Grove, Illinois, where he grew up, walking across a bridge one night, very late at night. This was a high bridge, one of those bridges that's high enough that you wouldn't want to jump off of it because you probably wouldn't survive. It was late at night. It was about midnight. As he got halfway across the bridge, he saw a man standing on the outside of the bridge, holding onto the ledge, acting as if he was going to jump. He said, I assumed this was likely a suicide attempt. And I decided I have an obligation to stop and talk to this man, to talk him out of what he was about to do. So I stopped and I asked the man if he were religious. And he said, yes. And I said, me too. I asked if you were a Christian. He said, yes. And I said, me too. What denomination are you? He said, well, I'm a Baptist. And I said, me too. Are you a Northern Baptist or are you a Southern Baptist? He said, I'm a Northern Baptist. And I said, me too. Are you a Northern Fundamentalist Baptist or a Northern Reformed Baptist? He said, well, I'm a Northern Fundamentalist Baptist. Me too. Are you a Northern Fundamentalist Baptist Conference of 1857 or a Northern Fundamentalist Baptist Conference of 1812? The man said, I'm a Northern Fundamentalist Baptist Conference of 1857. And I said, die, you heretic. And I pushed him on. Sometimes that's a little bit how it feels in Washington. People are always looking for an opportunity, no matter how often they might agree with people, to find them, to declare them, and to punish them as heretics. And so tonight, I want to talk a little bit about what can unite us as Americans, because heaven knows there's enough that divides us. Some of the things that can unite us are those things that have always united us, those things that make us distinctively American, those things that have made our culture amenable to the development of the greatest civilization the world has ever known. I'm talking first and foremost about our commitment to opportunity. This is and was, and I hope and pray ever will be, the land of opportunity. A land where you can come, and regardless of your circumstances, regardless of your birth, regardless of the wealth of your parents or their poverty, you have the chance here to build a better life, a life that your parents and your grandparents before them did not have. Opportunity is what America is about. Opportunity is what separates us from other lands. Opportunity is what's created by our system of government, which was designed for this very purpose, to preserve and protect opportunity. Opportunity, unfortunately, is being threatened today. It's being threatened and called into question at every level on the economic ladder. Let's start with the bottom of the ladder. Those who are at the bottom end of the socioeconomic spectrum. Those people who are struggling just to get by and doing everything they can just to be able to feed their families. Many of those people in America today are being held down by circumstances that make it more difficult for them to move up. Let me just cite a couple of examples to explain what I'm talking about. There's a recent study indicating that for the first time in our history, today, 40% of the bottom 20% of income earners in America are likely to remain in the bottom 20% throughout their whole lifetimes. That's very sad. We've always had poor in our country, and yet in our country, unlike most other countries throughout the history of mankind, we've had people who have been able to work their way out of poverty, who have had opportunities to no longer be poor. Too many of today's poor are likely to remain poor simply because of economic realities that we'll get to in a minute. Correspondingly, we've got an article that ran today in the National Review Online. This article said that in 38 states, plus the District of Columbia, someone who's on welfare benefits today would actually take a de facto pay cut if they chose, rather than to remain on their welfare benefits, to take an entry-level job, to start work as, for example, a secretary. This is troubling. This is troubling on a number of levels. Now, some people from within my own party might look at this from a different perspective. They might attack it by saying, oh, well, that just shows we shouldn't be doing that. That shows that we shouldn't be wasting money. It's not really the point. The point we ought to take away from this is it's unfortunate that government is trapping those people in poverty, because that's what that does. The only way you work your way up, see, is to start out in an entry-level job. Let's say a secretarial position. Everybody had a first job at some point. You have to have a first job, and for most people that means an entry-level job. You have to get that before you get your first promotion, and then your second, and then your next one after that, and after that. But it can be scary to go there. It can be prohibitively frightening for many Americans to go there, if, in order to take that first step, they have to put their family's well-being in jeopardy, and thus they're likely to remain in poverty far longer than they should, perhaps throughout the duration of their lives. I think that tells us a lot about that 40% figure, the 40% of the 20%. Let's go to the other end of the spectrum. Let's go to the top of the ladder next. We have government not only trapping people at the low end, we've got government artificially propping people up at the top end. We've got government engaging in policies that are geared toward crony capitalism, picking winners and losers in industry, favoring some industries while thwarting others. And within specific industries, you have government picking individual corporate winners and individual corporate losers, just depending on whether or not they stand in favor with the current government regime. This too is a problem. Then, last but not least, first and foremost, we have the middle class. Most of us in this room today. Those of us who have enough to get by from day to day, but who would like to do better, who would like to be able to provide an even better living for our families. People in America, in the middle class, are very often held in this place and unable to get ahead. Many people find themselves earning the same year after year, and what gains they make as far as wages from year to year often get swallowed up through a combination of inflation and the effects of oppressive regulation and taxation. This isn't fair. It isn't the kind of America that we want, and it isn't the kind of America that we are willing to settle to have. We must do better. How then do we get there? Well, we've got to start somewhere. Just as someone at the bottom of the ladder has to start with an entry-level job, we have to start somewhere. Sometimes we have to start with a step-by-step legislative approach, or changing Washington so that Washington better meets your needs. I'll be starting this fall to roll out a legislative agenda that will be geared toward doing this very kind of thing, toward minimizing the effect of government so that you can do what you do best, so that government will get out of your way and enable you to enjoy that which you've worked so hard to provide for your families. The first piece of legislation that I'll be rolling out will come out in September. It's a middle-class tax reform package, something that will simplify our current tax code, a tax code that occupies tens of thousands of pages, that no one's ever read in its entirety, no one ever will read in its entirety, and if they did read, they would promptly die. We have to do that. We have to replace it with a dramatically simplified system. In the case of this bill, it'll be 2 rates, just 2 rates. It'll be 2 rates accompanied by pro-middle class tax reform
that will specifically inure to the benefit of and help address the current bias against hardworking, middle-class American parents. You see, our current tax code has a bias, a penalty, if you will, that's built in. It's a hidden penalty that works against American parents, and we've got to undo that. I'll also be rolling out legislation dealing with a number of other issues, including some of the issues involving how we fund transportation. Currently, our transportation dollars that are taken out of what we pay at the gas pump go to Washington. They're filtered out by Washington. A portion of that money is sent back to the states, but it's not enough. It's not the same amount of money that we would prefer. It's not the same allocation of money that we would prefer. What we ought to do is keep in mind that this gasoline tax was created, it was put in place in the first place, back in the 1950s, when we wanted to build an interstate highway system. Well, that system was built by the early 1980s. It's done. Now, there's still some federal money that needs to be spent on maintaining those, particularly on maintaining those distinctively interstate hubs. But for the most part, large segments of that system can and currently is maintained by the states. There's a whole lot of other transportation infrastructure that already is maintained, built, rebuilt, maintained, paid for, funded at the state level, just with a combination of state and federal funds. The problem is that when they're using federal funds, they're subject to a whole host of additional regulatory requirements. It makes building roads far more costly, far more time-consuming, and far less effective. I want to make sure that you get your bang for your buck when it comes to the federal government, and I'm starting with these two areas. There will be a third bill that deals specifically with higher education. You know, in America, so much of our earning potential is tied up in our ability to obtain an education. What we've seen in recent years is that tuition rates just keep going up. They get more and more expensive every year. And as they continue to increase tuition, people continue to pay it. And you see, this is fostered by virtue of the fact that there is a virtual monopoly within the higher education system. It reflects an outmoded view of higher education, an outmoded view developed centuries ago, when to get a university education, you had to have a few things in the same location, and there was no way around it. You had to have books, professors, students, and classrooms all within the same location. But you know, that's a little bit of an anachronism in the information age. We can do better than that, and we can open up through our accreditation system a new system in which people will have more options at their disposal for getting an education. Once we unlock through this accreditation system, we will find that people will be able to get a better education on a more affordable basis, in part because there will be more competition. Now, there is another thing that I want to talk about at the outset tonight. There is a law called Obamacare that some of you might have heard of. Would you call that a good law, a great law, or the best law ever? That's what I thought. This is a law that was passed in 2010. It was passed without a single bipartisan vote. Passed on the basis of one party's margins. It was a law that no one had read at the time it was passed. I find this stunning. I find it irresponsible, because it's impossible to legislate responsibly if you haven't read the legislation first. The opinion of the American people regarding this law has not improved over time. It hasn't gotten better with age. We've discovered that Obamacare, in addition to making our health care unaffordable, is also going to be fundamentally unfair. Because the President has promised, the President has told us, that he is unwilling to implement the law as it was written. Now, this is a problem. He does not have the power to change the law after it's been enacted. The Constitution doesn't give him that power. The statute does not give him that power, and he can obtain that power and exercise it only if we let him do it. And I say we won't. He made to this law almost impossible to establish constitutional standing for someone to sue in federal court on the basis of these changes. Number two, even if we could get somebody with standing to sue on these, we have 1 year. He suspended 3 provisions of the law for 1 year. And we have only that 1 year with which to address this. After that year, the case becomes moot. The federal courts are powerless to address the issue, even assuming someone could get standing. And so we're left with the one power that Congress has jealously guarded. The one power that no one else can question. The power of the purse. So what I've been saying is, we've always known that Obamacare was going to make our health care less affordable. Premiums are going way up as a result of this law. We know now that Obamacare will also be unaffordable because the president has said he will enforce Obamacare with respect to individuals, but he's got a huge carve-out for big business, and that's not fair. So if the president's not going to implement the law, if he's not going to enforce the law as it was written, Congress should refuse to fund Obamacare. Listen, I'm sure you'll have questions about this and other issues. And so with that, why don't we open up the floor to questions? My Chief of Staff, Boyd Matheson, has the microphone. He'll be walking around to take your questions. And as you introduce your question, why don't you tell me your name and where you're from? I will be back here. I've got a pad of paper and a pen. I'll be taking notes if that's okay. I want to keep track of this because the most important part of this exercise for me is to hear from you. I want to remember what we talked about.
We're going to try to get through as many questions as we can tonight, so I will get to the front of the room, and the back of the room, and the side of the room as best we can. So if you can keep your questions focused, we'll rapid fire this as best we can. Start up here to this close.
My name is Spencer Sheets. I understood on your platform, if you ran for senator, you said you would never support bailouts. I understand you did support bailouts. Would you justify that position?
Okay. The question is, I ran on a platform that said I would not support bailouts. He's asking whether I do support bailouts. He is suggesting that I have. I have never supported bailouts. I don't, and I won't.
Senator Preston Davis from Payson, Utah. I'm a military veteran, draw pension. I rely on that quite a bit. When I look at security, liberty, and prosperity, and we're $17 trillion in debt almost, it makes me scared for not only my life before I grow old, but also for my children. You need to keep this fight up for Obamacare. I would rather lose my military pension, hopefully for only a very short period, than to lose my pension indefinitely with my country.
Thank you. President, thank you for your comment. More importantly, thank you for your service to our country. You're a hero.
And I live in Spanish Fort. I just wondered how much longer we're going to have to pay for the medical and the clothes and everything else for the illegal aliens in this state.
One of the few powers that Congress is given is the power to enforce our border, the power to make decisions regarding naturalization of citizens. And bad things happen when we don't exercise that power. You know, we've got a couple of problems with illegal immigration in that we have always been a nation of immigrants. I hope we always will be. Our country is great because it's been a place where immigrants have wanted to come for centuries. We've welcomed them in, and we have benefited tremendously economically and otherwise as a result of their coming here. They've brought tremendous ethnic, and cultural diversity to our country. Now, in order to make that happen, in order to remain a nation of immigrants, we've got to make sure that they keep coming through the front door, not the back door. The problem that we've had is that we've got a system of immigration laws that, based on the way they're enforced, has made legal immigration a very difficult, time-consuming, expensive, and at best uncertain endeavor in many cases. Simultaneously, we've had illegal immigration become relatively inexpensive and easy. We've got to flip that, we've got to turn it around. We've got to fix our legal immigration system. Most importantly, we've got to do that as a conditioned precedent to, along with, by the way, securing the border. We've got to do that before we are well equipped to deal with the needs of the 11 million or so who are here illegally. Let's get this done in the proper sequence. But we can't possibly address the needs of the 11 million until we first address the border security issues and until we first reform our legal immigration system.
I'm Rusty Scherer, originally from South Carolina, retired military here in Utah also. My question, I'm becoming very upset when I watch the committees, both the Senate and the House, where I thought you're supposed to tell the truth. We have the Secretary of State, the Attorney General, the head of NSA, the IRS. They come before the committees, they give misleading statements, even to the point of lying. Then later on, they say, oh, I apologize, yet they go with impunity. If I were called before Congress and I gave a lie, I'd probably end up in jail. So what I'm seeing is Congress is becoming very ineffective. How can you believe anybody who testifies before Congress if they're not held to the truth?
There we go.
You can't. That's the short answer. The longer answer is, it's a tough thing when you've got a government that is under the leadership of the party that is the president's party. So the Senate's under the control of the president's party and has, to my great frustration, been unwilling to stand up to the president even when the president starts to trample on legislative prerogatives. And he's done that time and time again. Remember his illegal recess appointments? I was widely criticized for the fact that I called him out on that, and I told him we've got to hold him accountable. Widely criticized by the press and the Washington Examiner. And yet, as it turned out, a few months later, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit agreed with me completely, and I felt vindicated. At the same time that was happening, at the same time I was being criticized by many of my colleagues in the Senate publicly, some in my own party. Many of them, some in the other party, were coming to me privately saying, Mike, I agree with you on this. The president overstepped his bounds. I just don't feel comfortable criticizing him for it. Bad things happen when people lie, especially when they lie in the context of government, when they lie in hearing regarding the operations of government. And then those in charge of government, those in charge of the legislative branch, for example, do nothing. So that's why I support the House of Representatives in moving forward, as they have on some occasions, with trying to hold people in contempt of Congress when they lie.
We're moving over to the left side now, Senator, just so you know.
That's my right, though.
Hi, my name is Bill Lapis, and I live in Orem, and I'm a moderate Democrat who's concerned about the national debt. The three biggest parts of our debt are Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security. And I was wondering, how do you plan on working with Democrats in addressing that? It's really important.
Thank you, Will. Thanks for coming tonight. I completely agree with you. Our national debt is of greatest concern to us. It wasn't very long ago that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mullen, said that our greatest threat to American national security is, in fact, our national debt. You know what's interesting is that currently on our national debt we pay about $225 billion a year just to service that debt. That's just our interest obligation. $225 billion a year. That is a lot of money. That's money that goes back to our creditors, money that we can't use for things like military equipment, military personnel, or other operations of government. But the interesting thing about that is that that's the same amount we were paying in interest 15 or 20 years ago, when our national debt was a third or fourth or even a fifth of its current size. The reason for that has to do with the fact that our treasury yield rates, the interest rate that we pay on our national debt, is at all-time historical lows. What's going to happen when a few years, when all of a sudden our treasury yield rate, the interest rate we pay on our national debt, goes back up just to historical norms, just to the historical average, even assuming we don't have a rebound above that? Within a short period of time, instead of $225 billion a year, we'll be paying $1 trillion a year in interest. We're going to have to come up with that $800 billion shortfall somewhere. That $800 billion shortfall, that's about what we spend on Medicare and Medicaid. And we're not going to be able to afford anything that we need to do at that point. Some will say at that point, well, just raise taxes. You can't close that. There's not a tax increase that is conceivable that could raise that amount of money, at least not without simultaneously decimating the American economy. And probably you'd have both problems. You wouldn't close the gap, and you would shrink economic growth to the point where you'd have less money rather than more. We could borrow more, but then our yield rate would go up higher, and instead of a $1 trillion annual payment, we'd have a $2 trillion annual payment. We could print more, but most people regard that as immoral, because that's a backdoor, almost invisible tax increase on the poor. And other countries have tried it. I think it's a bad idea here. To the extent we've done it, America's poor have suffered. The only other option at that point would be to cut big time, cut almost everything. Cut to a degree that would make what happened with sequestration look like nothing. That's what I worry about, because that's going to hurt the poor. And so in order to preserve our ability to fund Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and other programs that people have come to rely on over time, we've got to start making modest adjustments now. I've done that. It was one of the first things I did when I got to the United States Senate. Got almost no press coverage. For whatever reason, people didn't regard it as a sexy issue. But a couple of my colleagues and I came up with a solution that would render Social Security solvent over the 75-year window. We came up with another one that would do that with respect to Medicaid, all without touching benefits at all for those who are currently retired or approaching retirement age, within 10 years of retirement age. I came up then last year with my Saving the American Dream push, which had a tweaked, new and improved approach toward preserving all of those programs and making sure that we can fund them, making sure they're protected against the kind of eventualities that I described, while simultaneously bringing our budget to balance over a 5-year window. My point is that we can get there, Will. We really can. But there has to be more discussion of this. When we brought forward each of these proposals, it was very, very difficult to get co-sponsors. It was very difficult to get anyone to vote for it, just because people were content with the status quo. What they've got to hear from the American people, and they're hearing it plenty, they'll hear it more, is that the status quo won't work, is that the status quo will run us into bankruptcy. The status quo, most importantly, will hurt the poor and the vulnerable more than anything else we can do.
Good afternoon, Senator. My name is David Moore. My wife Kimberly. We're from Lehigh, Utah. And while we applaud your efforts to defund Obamacare, would you explain exactly how you plan on accomplishing this, particularly in respect to the fact that if this budget goes to the House, Senate, and the President, he can veto that budget, and he hasn't had one anyway, how are you going to succeed?
Yeah. Thank you, David, for raising that question. This is a very important issue. Here's how it would work. We would start with the House of Representatives passing what's called a continuing resolution, a funding mechanism that basically keeps government operating at current levels. That continuing resolution would fund everything in government except Obamacare. It would contain language carving out, restricting and forbidding any spending with regard to the further implementation and enforcement of Obamacare. We would do that using the language introduced by Congressman Tom Grady from Georgia, which is the same language used by Senator Ted Cruz from Texas on the Senate side. We would attach that as a writing to this continuing resolution. And so at that point, that continuing resolution, if enacted into law, once passed by the House, it would go over to the Senate. If passed by the Senate and submitted to the President, signed by the President, it would become law and it would be accomplished. We would keep government funded, but we would not fund, we would not be in a position to enforce Obamacare during the next fiscal year, starting on October 1st of this year, going through September 30th of next year. Now, there are a lot of people who have rather blatantly and unfairly characterized this statement, the recommendation for this approach. Even my simple letter that's now been signed by 14 Senate Republicans, we got a 14th signature today. Let me be very clear about this. I've never asked for a shutdown. I've never called for a shutdown. I don't want a shutdown. We don't need a shutdown. And what I'm trying to do is to avoid a shutdown. The only reason anyone even calls it a shutdown is itself an indication that they're willing to shut down the government. Even if we're willing to fund everything else in government, they're willing to shut it down if we won't give them everything they want, including Obamacare. And I say that's not fair. I've got one more thing to that. This is not an issue that outside of Washington, D.C. involves a battle between Democrats and Republicans. Not necessarily a battle between liberals and conservatives. This is about the political class of Washington against everyone else in America. And in that circumstance, I'm going to sign
Craig Larson from South Gordon, Utah. Senator Lee, I believe that the thing that is putting the foot on the brake of this economy is gas prices. And I also believe that we can do something about it. And what I would like to do is to recommend that the slogan for the 2014 election be, if you like paying what you're paying for gas now, vote for the Democrat. Yeah. If you want it a whole lot less, vote for a Republican.
I like the way you think, Craig. And look, there are people in both parties who do want us to develop our own energy. Increasingly, they need to hear from you. They need to hear, regardless of which party they come from, that you want us to develop our energy resources here in America. Because the truth is, we need that fuel. We need that. We rely on it. And if we don't produce it here, it's going to be produced somewhere else. If it's produced somewhere else, the odds are pretty good that a lot of that is going to be produced in countries where people don't like us very much, where the people growing wealthy off of that money are likely to use it against us in one way or another. But regardless of where it's produced, if it's not in America, that's taking jobs away from America. Jobs that the American people deserve a shot at. We're a wealthy nation in so many respects, including and especially in our energy resources. We need to develop that right here. We've got more oil resources right here in Utah than they have in the entire Middle East. If you're willing to exploit, if you're willing to extract responsibly in a manner that respects the environment, the oil that we have right here in Utah. We can produce oil in much the same quantity that they have in the Middle East. Let's do it.
Mary Johnson from Woodland Hills. Senator, after World War II, it was voted that presidents would only serve 2 terms, no longer a 3-term president, that all future presidents would just serve for 2 terms and then they were done. I wonder what's the feasibility of having term limits on the Hill? I feel country? Is it feasible? Could it ever happen?
Mary, anything's feasible if the people get behind it. I'm with you. I support constitutional term limits. We ought to limit members of Congress to 12 years in either house of Congress. 2 terms in the Senate ought to be enough.
Senator Lee. My name is Larry Sorenzi, here from the Spanish. Senator, I first want to thank you for, you've taken a lot of hits, for standing up for the things that we all believe in. And I want to thank you. Second of all, I just want to back up what you just said about our energy resources. And I'll give you the example that we talked about before. The Escalante staircase. That thing at 62 billion tons of coal is 330 billion barrels of oil. Prudhoe Bay is only 25. And it's only been drilled, about a third of it. That thing is 1 trillion barrels. There's 14 or 15 deposits just like it. We have 35 deposits of uranium that are 5 miles in size. We have trillions of barrels of oil shale. And I say this only so that people realize when you say the energy we have here, it's on a scale that's almost unimaginable if we can get our land back. Where are we on that?
As you point out, and as I mentioned a moment ago, we have tremendous energy resources right here in our own state. In addition to those that you mentioned, we've got 1.2 trillion barrels of proven recoverable reserves that are locked up in oil shale. 1.2 trillion barrels, that's more than all the oil in the Middle East combined. And yet we can't get to that, we can't produce it commercially, because almost all of that is on federal land. 2/3 of our land in Utah is owned by the federal government. As a result of that, we can't tax that land, we can't regulate that land. It's harder to fund our schools and essential government services. We can't get to it to produce energy. We can't get to it in some cases even for recreational purposes. And you know, they shouldn't keep all that land. It doesn't belong to them. It belongs to the American people, and it affects us right here in Utah first and foremost. You know, there was a promise made in our statehood enabling legislation. It became effective in 1896. It made an implicit, if not explicit, promise to the effect that unincorporated federal public land within the state of Utah would be sold, and that 5% of the proceeds of the sale of that land would be put into a trust fund for Utah's public education system. Similar promises were made in the enabling legislation of other states. Other states like Missouri, other states like North Dakota. The federal government made good on that promise and has never made good on its promise with the state of Utah. We've got to begin on a step-by-step basis. We can't turn this around overnight. But as a member of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, you've got my commitment. I'm going to continue to fight to make sure that we move in the right direction. The first step in the right direction is to urge Congress, which I'm currently doing, to fully fund what's called the PILT program. It stands for Payment in Lieu of Taxes. Currently, Congress tries to offset the property tax hit that we take, because we can't tax that land, by giving us a small fraction of what we would otherwise get in property taxes from that land. If Congress had to pay the full tax equivalent amount every year to the state and its taxing jurisdictions, we'd have the money that we needed in a more responsible fashion than it will be anywhere else in the world. I want that done here, where we can take advantage of the job, where we can benefit from the economic development associated with it. So bring it forward, Larry. Keep calling for it, and I'm going to keep doing everything I can.
Thank you.
Senator, I was just recently made aware of the fact that in the Constitution, there's another method by which we can amend the Constitution without having to go through Congress. We can do it through the states. And I would suggest that, I would like to know first if you would be in support of several amendments, one of which would be a balanced budget amendment, one which would be a term limit amendment, one would be prohibit government, the federal government, from being in any of our lives, if not specifically in the Constitution. Maybe if we took 2 or 3 of those amendments and took our government back through the states, not the federal government, because Although I do wish to applaud you for your outspoken leadership, you and 3 or 4 of your senator companions, which I greatly admire, I want to know you guys simply can't carry the water on this thing. We, the people, have got to take this country back ourselves. And we've got to get our state folks here to lead us in that process. And let's get the federal government out of the areas of our Constitution they're not supposed to be in.
Thank you, Ron Ivey. I can tell you're a patriot with passion for freedom and for our way of life in America, which is constantly under attack. I'm familiar, it sounds like you're referring to Mark Levin's new book. I just started reading it. Liberty Amendments. Mark Levin is a friend, he's a scholar, and I've learned much from him, and I'm continuing to learn much from him as I read his book. You asked whether I support certain proposed amendments to the Constitution. Balanced budget amendment? Yes. The very first thing I filed when I was sworn into the United States Senate was a balanced budget amendment. I am a champion of that. I've even written a book about it. I'm going to continue to fight for it as long as I'm there. Term limits. I stand for it. A separate amendment saying the federal government ought to keep out if it's not in the Constitution. We already have an amendment like that. It's called the 10th Amendment. Unfortunately, we don't follow it. To follow it, we've got to change who we elect to Congress, and I need your help to do that. Finally, Ron, with regard to your question about the mechanisms for Congress has regrettably, tragically, ignored the American people over and over and over again. It's sad. It breaks my heart to watch it happen. This is why people are moving to that. I still have been concerned about the idea of calling for a constitutional convention. Let me tell you why. When we put together that convention, who's going to be in charge of putting it together? Who's going to be in charge of calling for it? Well, it would be John Boehner and Harry Reid. I trust Harry Reid less than I trusted James Madison and George Washington. So, while I understand the call for it, and it's definitely something to consider seriously, it's not without some peril, and we need to look out for
that. Senator Lee, Grace Huffaker from Mapleton. First of all, I also would like to thank you for all that you're doing for America, for the conservatives here in Utah. I follow you closely. You and Jason and Rand Paul are doing your best, but you are a minority. And we as American citizens are so frustrated. I just can't tell you. You say let's elect people, but we have fraudulent elections that nobody does anything about. And those that say let's get, go to the Social Security and get rid of Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security. I have been a realtor for 34 years. I have worked with illegal aliens that told me they get Social Security every month. $1,700, $2,200. It just flabbergasts me. I haven't sold them anything, but I'm just shocked when they tell me that they get this. I've been in Salt Lake at the workforce. I have heard them tell me, the men that work there in government, that there is an immigrant law that is in full force, that they're bringing in immigrants here from many thousands and thousands of Muslims, from Middle East, Africa, etc. The minute they get to America, if they want to start a business, they get $40,000. They get free housing. They get free welfare money. This is why we're going bankrupt. We're giving billions to the Muslim Brotherhood, who are, their whole purpose is to eradicate Israel and America. Why are we doing this? Why is this president allowed to do this?